The webinar is broken up into a couple of parts. We'll give you some of our perspective. I'm here today with Charlotte Goodhue from the MCC Museum at Lord's, and I will give a bit of an introduction to why we're doing these workshops. Apologies for those of you who attended last week, as there'll be a bit of repetition in my bit, but just to give you a bit of context and why we're doing it. I'll pass on to Charlotte, who will talk about some of her work at MCC. And then for the last part of the workshop, we'll again be handing over to you. And what we're hoping is that you might ask questions or raise any points for discussion around some of the themes that we're hoping to address in the workshops. So just to give you a bit of introduction, this is the second in a series of 3 workshops that have been developed on the back of a recent project that was undertaken by Sporting Heritage this year called the Ignored Sporting Heritage Project. In a nutshell, the workshops are all about how we collect and preserve sporting heritage, how we involve communities and audiences in this, and how we ensure that our sporting heritage represents the rich and diverse history of sport in Britain. And these workshops are taking place across 3 weeks. The first one was last week, and I'll mention that again in a second. There's this one today, obviously, and then there's another one next Friday, which will be with Sarah Priestley from Watford Museum and looking at working with audiences. And each of the workshops features a different speaker and a unique project that has looked to develop new approaches to democratic and community-driven heritage collecting. So the background for these workshops, they came from, as I said, the Ignored Sporting Heritage Project, which ran from January to March this year and looked to explore the state of diverse ethnic representation in the UK's sporting heritage collections. The project gathered quite a vast range of perspective on the issue, interviewing representatives of heritage organisations, grassroots sports clubs, charities, community organisations that work to confront racism in sport, and academic specialists in race and sport. And the project concluded that despite the rich and diverse heritage of sport in Britain, ethnically diverse communities are critically underrepresented in sporting heritage collections. And yeah, the project set out to understand the reasons behind this and identify what we can do as heritage professionals to challenge this and build a more inclusive and representative picture of the history of sport. And some of the issues that we identified were unique to sporting heritage. For example, we identified that sporting heritage collections largely tend to represent the administration of sport and sports governance, and that fewer collections represent the wider social historical perspective on the history of sport, or focus, for example, on grassroots sport or fans and supporters. And that this generally means that heritage collections, sporting heritage collections, tend to occasionally reflect the inequalities existent within professional and elite sport and don't account for the wider representation or levels of participation in other levels of sport. And some of the other issues we identified are relevant to the museum sector, the heritage sector as a whole. For example, significant structural inequalities within heritage. For example, according to the Archives and Records Association, 97% of people who work in archives are white, and that this skews the perspective on prioritising collecting and challenging biases in collecting practice. And increasing attention is also being paid to how museums and archives actually collect, how they make decisions about collecting, who is involved in this process. It's widely observed that museums and archives tend to rely on quite reactive means of collecting. For example, taking material that's offered to them rather than actively kind of seeking to shape their collections through community collecting and active collecting that seeks to fill gaps and increase representation of different communities. And yeah, in our report, we emphasise that these challenges need to be addressed in order to ensure that sporting heritage remains relevant, accurate and insightful. Sport is arguably the most high-profile public forum for discussion about race and racism in our society. And as such, the history of sport has quite unique insights to offer on a range of issues, from race and racism to community cohesion, migration, culture, but without collections that represent the diversity involvement in the history of sport, we can't adequately tell these stories. So we are hoping to use these workshops to look at new approaches to collecting. And new approaches, require resources, and they require, input and thought and time. And we're aware of that. It's not an easy kind of quick fix solution to developing new strategies for collecting. But as the Museums Association point out in their latest collecting strategy called Empowering Collections, which is definitely worth a read as a kind of introduction to the issues of community-driven collecting. Collecting strategically in partnership with users and communities can be carried out at, quote, relatively low cost and with substantial social impact. And a lot of organizations have developed quite groundbreaking approaches to collecting. For example, Birmingham Museums, their Collecting Birmingham project, which ran from, I think, 2014 to 2018 or thereabouts, was a really powerful example of community-driven collecting. And there are other kind of similar case studies out there for anyone wanting to kind of identify useful examples of community collecting projects. But yeah, we were aware that it's not straightforward for organizations to achieve that level of project, and that there are barriers to creating links with communities and developing kind of fruitful collaboration. So what we're hoping to do with these workshops is to kind of give space for discussion and reflection on how we collect sporting heritage. We don't really intend to offer hard and fast solutions, because every organization is different and everyone has their own challenges and opportunities. But we want to give opportunity for people to talk about your collecting, how your ambitions perhaps, and any questions you might have about how you can kind of shape your collecting strategy to be perhaps more inclusive, or to develop links with communities and such like. And there will be hopefully some kind of quite useful practical insights to pick up along the way. And these will no doubt come more from our speakers. We have, as I said, we have 3 fantastic speakers across the workshops, from within sporting heritage and within the wider heritage sector, who will share with us projects that have looked to deliver community-driven approaches to collecting. Last week, so we heard from Jenny Vickers. So those of you who were with us last week will know this already, but Jenny works at the Ahmed Iqbal Ullah Race Relations Resource Centre in Manchester, and she spoke about the centre's work with diverse ethnic communities around Greater Manchester to support them to collect and preserve their own heritage. If you weren't able to join us for that, I'd really recommend going back and watching that session, and particularly Jenny's bit on their projects. I'm guessing I'll be online at some point. Fran, you might be able to confirm.
Yes, I'm just doing the final bit of editing on last week's session. So yes, I will ping round a wrap up to everybody who was at that session. And then if you check out our YouTube webinar archive, it'll be highlighted in the next newsletter. But yes, it will all be up there. And yeah, definitely well worth watching. And I'll put the web address in the chat, because they had loads of fantastic resources on their website as well.
Yeah, Jenny shared with us their website, which has some really, really great resources for anyone wanting to develop community-led projects. And I think it's racearchive.org.uk, or you can Google, racearchive.org.uk. But yeah, I should point out that these 3 workshops aren't solely geared around ethnic diversity and representation, even though that's a very kind of strong strand of the workshops. But we'll look more widely on how we involve different communities, different voices, different perspectives in our collecting approach and how we use this input to build collections that are truly representative of the diverse landscape and history of sport in Britain. So the workshops are roughly themed. So last week's was practical approaches to working with communities. The theme of this week's workshop is loosely, very loosely, around working with partners, so specialists, academics, people who have a very kind of unique knowledge on sport or on the history of sport or on communities, to help us develop new approaches to collecting. The Ignored Sporting Heritage Project identified quite considerable opportunity for collaboration between sporting heritage collections and others to develop new ways of engaging communities and collecting sporting heritage. Just in reflection of last week's workshop, one point of discussion that emerged was how we gain understanding of diverse participation in the sports that we represent, like when it's not always something that we're completely perhaps knowledgeable about. We might not have that kind of complete perspective on who participates in sports at different levels, what communities, what groups. Another point of discussion that emerged was how we actually make links with communities. You know, it's easy saying, like, you know, working with communities, but, you know, how do you do that? It's like, how do you actually go and start those conversations? So I'm hoping that this week's workshop might offer a chance to kind of like further elaborate on that and reflect a bit, because one issue that we addressed in the project was that there are plenty of specialists and people with unique perspectives out there who can offer a very, very valuable perspective, very valuable knowledge, but also help to kind of make those links with communities. So, for example, there are a growing number of academics who specialize in very kind of specific areas of participation in sport, for example, around race and racism in sport, or academics who have unique and quite niche insights into the landscape of sporting participation and the history of sport. There are many groups who work to promote equal representation in sport today who have a unique knowledge of the communities that are involved in sport. So, for example, national campaigning groups such as Sporting Equals or the Scottish Ethnic Minority Sports Association, right down to kind of local grassroots community groups, and other kind of potential partners. There's a range of kind of avenues of exploration. And these partners can offer connections with communities, they can offer in-depth knowledge, and they can help shape and inform collecting practices. So today we're going to hear from Charlotte from MCC Museum at Lords, whose work has frequently addressed issues such as representation and community collaboration, and who has substantial experience of working with a wide range of partners to develop new approaches to collecting. Charlotte's asked me to share, sorry, I'm speaking on your behalf, a video, because the focus of Charlotte's talk today will be on the Women in Cricket project at MCC. I'm just going to share, if I can, a quick video. I just realized I haven't shared my PowerPoint at all. A quick video. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, that looks great.
Great.
These women to enter this rather masculine province of cricket.
Big muscles. No, this is the thing that always perhaps tends to annoy us a little bit, that people say it's a man's world in cricket.
So the aim of the project was to tell the story of women's cricket, and also to diversify the collection that we have here at Lords.
It's really a sport that has been ignored for far too long, and it's a time now, I think, in this current day, where women are fully professional, that they should be given the full light of day. And these women want to know where cricket has come from, history is as deep as the men. It deserves really to have that show.
I think that exhibition spaces are great spaces to be able to challenge attitudes and create discussions around topics. We really hope that this exhibition will positively influence the future direction of the game.
So I'm now going to pass on to Charlotte.
Hi everyone, great to see you. Yeah, I'm just going to give you a bit of a background about myself and about the project and exhibition and the different curatorial methods that I used. I'll also talk about the learnings, the challenges and the outcomes, and some of our other projects as well at the end. Yeah, just to give you a bit of background about myself. So I've got background in art history and museums, and I've worked globally for different private and public art and history collections. MCC was not the first time I worked with sports. I came from a background of curating and playing sports, including golf. I based my postgraduate museum studies research on an award-winning Afro-American artist called Fred Wilson, who I worked with to challenge museum systems as well as conventional display and interpretation techniques at the 51st Biennale. Wilson actually inspired all of my curatorial choices to date and this type of work, which is very on trend with, responses to Black Lives Matter, equality, inclusion and diversity. And I must also mention that I'm dyslexic, and all of my work and projects take into consideration accessibility and inclusion. So I've lived experience of feeling left out of some conversations or ways of seeing and understanding and interacting with stories, words and environments. I think I approach things with a lot of creativity and desire to tell impactful and personal stories as a way of understanding and relating to history. So just a bit about myself. Yeah, so I joined MCC 10 years ago, and at the time my remit was to bring the museum up to accreditation standards. Just to give you an idea, the museum at the time didn't even have an acquisition policy. So I researched the collection, identified gaps and made recommendations. I wrote our first collecting development policy, and I managed aspects of our collecting. And this was quite challenging before the Evolution project. And I think that this was because there was a history of inherent unconscious bias in MCC's approach to collecting historically. But we're at the stage now where we're openly talking about this and learning from the past moving forwards. So MCC, or Lord's Cricket Ground, brand themselves as being the home of cricket. However, it was missing a vital part of the story, half the story, in fact, the women's story. So how could it be the home of cricket if everyone was not represented? And I don't just mean in the museum, I just mean generally with the types of items we collected and displayed, but also looking at our audience and our membership and different aspects, looking at the branding, the narrative, the attitudes, and all the conversations that I overheard. The women just weren't a part of the narrative, the conversation. So I set about filling gaps, challenging attitudes, and as part of the Women's Cricket exhibition, it took 3 years to get to the stage where we could comprehensively tell the full story of the history and development of women's cricket. I came up against numerous challenges, but I tried to identify the challenges, limitations, and any critics of the project from the outset. Just to give you an example, we were doing things in the same way for a long time, and an attitude from my line manager actually was that perhaps we should be showing items in the exhibition like made by women, so women kind of like facilitating the game. And I very early on really wanted all of the imagery to show women at the heart of the game, action photography, and to put the attention there so that they were very much, the subject on the pitch in action. So you rarely see sort of graphic images in the exhibition where women are sort of sitting on the sidelines or doing a social event like they're actually in the game playing it. So at the time, I did feel a little bit like I was a lone voice, sort of championing equality in women's cricket. And I really wanted a support network and internal sponsors with weight. I drew up a list of people who might critique or review the show when it opened, and I emailed them asking if they would get involved from the outset. So I set up this evolution working group consisting of academics, for example, Ralph Nicholson, Adam McKay, as well as former players, commentators, spectators, and photographers who had documented the game over many, many years and who had fantastic archival resources and images that we could draw upon. So I also reached out to Somerset Cricket Museum at about the right time, I think, because they were previously known as the home of women's cricket. So that's where you went if you wanted to research the game. But the museum was volunteer run and it was running out of funds. They simply couldn't look after the Women's Cricket Association. And it was in a bit of disarray because they didn't have adequate storage. And it hadn't been catalogued. It had been there for years and it hadn't been catalogued just because of the resources there were sort of running low. So under my project brief, I went there to see if we could borrow some of the items for the collection, but actually I was offered a transfer of the Women's Cricket Association archive. So we negotiated that, and at MCC we're very lucky and fortunate that we had 2 full-time archivists to go through 30,000 sort of papers and document it and digitize it all. So this was a full-time cataloguing project for about 2 years. But this archive proved to be an amazing research resource, and many of the kind of the papers and manuscripts and photographs can be seen there on display. A lot of my job involved networking and bringing people together, but it was a pleasure because honestly, everyone had this shared interest and passion for women's cricket and this desire to tell the story and to get it out there. I was the only curator on the team, but it was definitely a great way to skill swap and knowledge share. I see the role of the curator as as someone who brings people together to tell stories, to consider different perspectives, to discuss and debate before opening the subject up to viewers who also, we want to engage and for them to have subsequent discussions and conversations. So the aims of the project, so it wasn't just an exhibition, it was a whole collecting project, because when I first looked at the collection, we just didn't have the items to fully tell the story. But as soon as sort of word got out and I started working with the Evolution group, they had fantastic contacts. We were suddenly in contact with families and former cricketers, and the network just grew and grew. The aims of the project were to develop the most comprehensive collection of cricket art and artifacts in the world, and that has been an aim for ages, but the women were left out of that, and now they're very much included, to tell the whole story of women's cricket factually and transparently. So we didn't shy away from any difficult facts, attitudes, or stories, but we confront them and we encourage debate and discussion. And we're hoping to influence the narrative around women's cricket in general. So this is not really a sort of one-off exhibition, because since it's been open, which is just literally since Monday, already we've had more offers of donations, more people sort of coming forwards with stories, and so our collecting really has just begun in lots of ways. And also, so beyond the exhibition's on for a couple of years now. But beyond the exhibition, we're now injecting women's cricket into all of the displays and exhibitions around Lords, even the branding. So recently I was working with a graphic designer on one of our new restaurants in the new stands that we've just built. And they're drawing sort of outlines of cricketers, but some of them are obviously female, some of them are gender neutral. So just in terms of imagery, getting a more positive image of cricket out. Also, the exhibition hopes to positively influence the future direction of the game. For example, more matches for women on the main ground, more discussion around equal pay, representation and exposure. So when we were thinking about developing the exhibition, I set out some very clear themes for our meetings, and we spoke about what stories we wanted to tell from all of these different perspectives, including personal stories, institutional stories, club stories and perspectives. We didn't really want to leave anything out. But we did sort of identify a clear scope at the same time, and we were limited by our space and by the objects, items that we had. The meetings covered everything from collecting and displaying items to interpretation, themes, programming, engaging, promoting the show. So just to give you an overview, the themes, we identified 6 key themes, and this was largely because of our space. So in our upper floor gallery, we have 6 alcoves and 6 projector screens and 6 flat cases. So it just fitted the space to have 6 themes, and these are the birth of the game, climbing mountains. So this was a metaphor for the struggle, but also playing high. There was a charity match on the top of Mount Kenya. Forming the Women's Cricket Association, touring, Women's Cricket Association to the England Cricket Board, so that transition, and ladies to Lords, ladies at Lords. And the 6 players that we identified, I mean, obviously there's numerous key pivotal people, personalities, but we limited it to 6. So we looked at telling, the story in 6 from the beginning, and we chose Betty Archdale, Molly Hyde, Enid Bakewell, Jan Breton, Claire Taylor, and Shabangi Kulkarni. Other people are represented in the cases in team photographs or in their affiliated clubs, but these are the personal stories that we focused on. And largely as well, this came down to what items we had also to tell the story. We also wanted to be very upfront with our audience about the limitations of the exhibition and the fact that this story is very much told from a UK-centric perspective. Although the loan from Shabangi Kulkarni goes some way to help us tell a more global story. So in the future, we're really looking, if we had a second phase of this exhibition, we would look more internationally at telling the story. And we're certainly developing our collection to be able to do that at the moment. I realised sort of quite early on that this exhibition is just the beginning of a lot of our diversity, inclusion and equality work. And as I said, more donations came flooding in just this week and before we opened as well. So during the few years that I started curating this exhibition, I also took on a new role, which is programming. Just because in the past, my exhibitions, I've also had like conferences and symposiums, and I wanted to very much tie in exhibitions with like adult education programs and community programs as well. So we're planning a women's evolution conference in October, where we're talking to many of the people who sat on the evolution working party, who donated items, who have played the game. And we're also working with the Sports Heritage Network on this cross-generational, engagement. So just to give you an example, one of the loans came from St Leonard's School in Scotland. They were a school very early on that pioneered or encouraged their girls to take part in sport, even when it was seen as unladylike in the Victorian era. And they have this fantastic resource that they lent us. But the girls there still have a really strong cricket team, and the old girls who used to play are still sort of very much in touch, and they're coming down to Lords for like an old girls tea, and they're going to experience the exhibition with some of their current students as well. So we're just looking at this cross-generation kind of inspiring each other. Because often at Lords we have, fathers and sons coming around the museum or coming to a cricket match, but we thought it would be really nice to just encourage, mothers and daughters, maybe with a kind of afternoon tea and a look round, and also a chance to actually play in the nets. I must just mention that I played cricket for 5 years at a club in Hampstead, which is quite close to Lords. And when we started, we just had one women's team, and now we have 3. You know, the people at the club have been just great in promoting the sport, getting new people involved. It's very friendly, it's very accessible. It's really inspired me and this project. And we're lucky enough to have some sort of celebrity champions of the game down there. And we're hosting an old girls versus new girls club competition, and some of my teammates were actually inspired by their mothers, a couple of whom played first class cricket. So I'm going down to the match. I'm not playing this time, but I'm going down to collect some oral histories and some stories for our oral history project, which is an add-on to this. And I just think that working with sports museums is so interesting because, you know, our museum is at Lords, it's part of the club, and history is made, you know, like daily, sometimes during the season. And it's really nice to have a collection that's active, that's responsive, that's influencing the current game. You know, I see the museum as being a microcosm of cricket generally, of society, and I think it's so important to hold these discussions and have these debates and influence a positive future direction for the game. So yeah, I'm so excited that this is the first comprehensive exhibition on the history and development. It's been made possible by so many kind donations and loans, and we didn't have a big budget for this project at all. Like, we do have a, you know, fairly healthy acquisition fund, but it was always you know, like for commissions and things like this, and my budget was super small, but I just found that we had more donations than I dreamt of, and actually even items just coming up on eBay in terms of like photographs and things, quite, you know, financially like low value but high historic value. So that was just brilliant. And I had people from the Evolution group just, you know, with eyes out spotting things all the time. Yeah, so that's a bit about the sort of project, and I'm like so happy to take any questions that you might have. You know, we've got a lot of other sort of equality, inclusion, diversity work happening at the moment, just in terms of, you know, undertaking a big like collections review and looking at reinterpreting our collections, looking at different perspectives, and engaging audiences, communities in community interpretation projects and workshops and surveys, some very unconventional stuff as well. So I think this is a really exciting time for me working at Lords, but also just generally for the museum sector. I know there's a lot of like challenges that have come up, but I think it's an exciting sort of time for turning things around. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. That was really, really insightful. It's such an inspiring project to hear about. I was really, really intrigued by, you know, what you were saying specifically about that kind of how the cohesion with the activity in the current game as well, and how you're feeding into wider conversations about representation in the game today. And that what you were saying about even just like the graphics on the restaurant was really, really interesting. And how I think there is obviously such a clear, because it's such a conversation at the moment in sport, you know, representation, whether that's gender representation or ethnic diversity, or then there's so much opportunity to tie in that activity, I guess, and use one to inspire the other and inform the other.
Exactly.
So that was really fascinating. And also what you said about collecting, how you're continuing to collect new material on the back of the Women in Cricket project. And that, again, that's really interesting to me, because that, I guess my perception on creating new approaches to collecting is to kind of break that feedback loop that exists. Like, a lot of the time people, you know, museums collect from people who already see themselves in museums, and the challenge really isn't to just like supplement that with some, you know, representation of other communities and people, but it's to break that instinctual kind of perception that museums only represent a certain section of society. So I think that applies, I'd argue that applies to like other aspects of kind of, I guess, diverse collecting. Is that?
I mean, I'm always saying let's consciously collect. So let's be very aware of our historical patterns, you know, because even within our collections team, you know, we're all white, we're all like from working class backgrounds, we all went to state school. So already like there is a sort of like limitation in our perspective. So yeah, just to kind of like think, constantly challenge ourselves, and I'm constantly challenging, you know, even like my line manager, and I'm like, oh, you always do this, you know. So but it's good because we're talking about it openly and inviting the discussion and the challenge.
No, this is great to hear. I just had one question before I'll pass on to everyone else in a minute. But, you mentioned that to launch the project, you approached various academics and you just mentioned photographers and other people with kind of unique insight and perspective and perhaps collections. How did you make those links, and what was their kind of initial response? Were they largely just like kind of positive and wanting to get involved, or was there any kind of hesitancy or discussion around the purposes of the project?
I just thought this is a great opportunity, but now some of them I was aware of already just through like books that they'd written, or I'd, you know, previously met them, and just through discussions it was like very much a case of like, oh, have you spoken to such and such, or, you know, this person's doing this and this, and I'd, you know, get the contact details, and just, you know, through really sort of like being in the sport myself and playing it and sort of understanding it like from that side of things as well, and from a club level kind of perspective. I mean, I had so many people I could approach, really. So I just, as I said to you, I thought about the people who were qualified to critique the show, and I went for them first.
That's really, really, really interesting. Thank you again. Thank you so much. And so we've got roughly 20 minutes. And what we were hoping to do with this part of the workshop was, if anyone has any questions, observations, kind of points for discussion, anything that they want to raise around either community collecting, working with communities, you know, developing new approaches to collecting, or more specifically around, you know, working with those partners and other specialists, or anything in connection to Charlotte's presentation there and about the MCC project. I think, Fran, we said if anyone doesn't have any questions, if you just want to kind of introduce yourself and give a bit of background on which other organisation you represent or what work you're doing. But yeah, I'll pass over to the floor.
There's a question already in the chat, so I don't know, Charlotte, if you want to pick up that, because that's specifically in relation from Rajiv about the MCC, and then Brian will come to you next.
So are you at MCC already looking at sports history, blogging, essay competitions, etc., to drive engagement and bring in people thinkers? So yeah, in terms of like we're encouraging the discussion, and however people want to like engage in it, so like through Twitter, through you know, articles, writing about it, like, yeah, definitely, like, we're open to that. We don't have anything like an essay competition as such at the moment, but just in terms of like workshops, you know, we've got a few that are sort of happening soon in September, October, but also like we're responding as well to what people would like, and so like we're still actively programming alongside the exhibition.
And is it just, Rajiv, you're the one who posed the question. Have you got experience of doing that sort of activity to drive engagement? Is it something that you found successful in your work? Okay, I'm not sure they're there. Okay, Brian, do you want to jump in? You had a question.
Yes, thank you very much, Charlotte. Lovely to meet you. I'm Brian Worrell from the England Netball Heritage and Archive Group. Your little film at the front, interesting, if you look at the similarities between your 1890 players and Netball's England 1890 players, you'll see a very common thread about the dress. So I assume it was a sport for nice ladies, as netball was in those days. Also, I have worked with Rachel Hayhoe-Flint, who knew an awful lot about netball, by the way, particularly when she was a great commentator for some of our international matches and things. So, and she was a lovely and great lady. My question, however, is I assume that the cricket or MCC or whoever is wholly supportive of funding you, and I think you said a line manager to do this work. And what I'm involved in is an archive rather than a museum, and so it would be interesting to know how you go about. No, wrong question. How did you persuade the MCC or the Cricket Association to actually employ a curator, stroke archivist, stroke records manager, or whatever that you seem to be?
Yeah, so MCC had a collection, and I went for an interview with someone who had a background in like auctioneering and sort of buying and selling art, and we were they were looking to sort of make a more professional museum, and but they didn't exactly know what they had in the collection. But obviously it was a big sort of like financial asset for them as well. So I sort of stepped in to look after this like financial asset, but also historically, significant. And a lot of my work was kind of really like explaining like the historical significance and how valuable that was, and how it created a sort of special identity for MCC, as because before they were branded as the keepers of the laws of cricket, but then we sort of said, well, actually you're also the keepers of the history and the art of cricket, and the social side. I mean, they were, but they weren't really aware of it. So they had this collection, and a lot of my work was going through it, cataloguing it, employing cataloguers to go through it. To write all the spectrum, policies and procedures, so that we were working towards accreditation standards. And the way we sort of sold this was that, you have to look after this, asset is not going to look after itself. It was all very much, the pros of doing this, and what happens if you don't do this, if you don't look after the history for future generations, if you don't inspire them, So the team just grew and grew, and after we had things catalogued, we were able to just pitch ideas and exhibition themes, and to know what we had and what stories we could tell, but also what stories we couldn't tell. And if we wanted to tell those stories, then we'd go after the collections and the people who could help us tell those stories. And also loans was a big thing, because you can't request significant loans from other museums unless you're a kind of accreditation standard, museum facility. So it really was such an interesting journey from working with a club collection that wasn't small to a museum working towards accreditation, like a national cricket museum that's also telling international stories, also beyond cricket. So we're also thinking about looking at our current audience, but also at the people that don't come, and why don't they come, and how can we inspire them as well, because it might not just be cricket. Like in the exhibition, for example, there's this one letter to Molly Hyde from her school mistress, and it's such an inspiring letter. It's sort of thanking her for developing this cricket team, and I just think that anyone who read that letter would be inspired, no matter if you're a girl, if you're into cricket, who you are. It's such a beautiful, inspiring letter, and I just really want to look beyond this, the subject. We're looking at so many different sub-subjects, just more generally women in sport, women in society, people just generally feeling left out, or that they don't have any positive role models, or there's a whole bunch of stuff.
So the museum at Lords is now very much part of the whole offer. A day out at Lords includes a visit to the museum. From what I've seen when I've been on site and from the branding and the marketing, you're very much at the heart of the heritage of that, like you say, that story, the home of history.
I mean, it's been a journey. So just to like the internal work that we've done as well to get to sort of facilitate the work of other departments. So just yesterday I had a meeting with like hospitality, and they were like, oh, we're selling these packages, we've got 3 new bars, but wouldn't it be great to like have like the high, say for example like the high flyers bar or something, and tie it in with the first teams to fly around the world, and actually the first team was a women's team, and maybe look at that, or like the RAF and the link to cricket, their cricket teams. So it's kind of just building in heritage like across the whole ground, like where you wouldn't even expect it, and having all these sort of satellite exhibitions, displays, even if they're just graphic displays, because obviously you can only have like the historically like important items within the museum, conditioned building that's purpose kind of built, but you can tell the stories like around the grounds and off-site, digitally, online. We've got online exhibitions and programs. Our conference is going to be part on site, part live, so a hybrid. Has
anybody else got any other questions? Tamsin.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. I'll just introduce myself if no one's met me. I'm Tamsin. I'm a trainee curator at the Museum of Cornish Life down here in Cornwall, a little social history museum. But I'm very interested in women's cricket because last year I wrote my MA thesis on women's cricket and its hidden heritage and how it's becoming unhidden. So it's really fantastic, to hear about all the work the MCC is doing. My question is, you mentioned that from the outset of the project, you went into it trying to identify any challenges and critiques that you might come across. Over the course of that 3 years, were you faced with anything that surprised you or any challenges that you weren't expecting?
I think just the way like displays had been done before. I mean, just as I mentioned to you, like just with some of the people that I worked with, thought I would approach this in one way, and I didn't. I just, I was like, great, this is my opportunity to like, pull on all the stuff that I've done before, like, honestly, like Fred Wilson's like revolutionary award-winning curator doing stuff like this, 20, 30 years ago. And it was just a great opportunity. And under the umbrella of women's cricket, I think I was just given a bit more like free reign. It was like, okay, that's, you can do that. You play cricket, you're a curator, you can do that one. You're a female. But yeah, so I just like really invited any challenges that I came across. And if there was an attitude or someone would say something, I would just like, want to know more, like where that was coming from and why they thought that, and then try to address it in the exhibition. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you.
Sorry, Tamsin. Picking up on that idea, you talked about unconscious bias, and it's quite, and this is purely my assumption, but thinking of sort of the way that the institution of the MCC and Lords is set up, trying to approach that sort of hierarchical structure and talk about unconscious bias. How easy was that, and how easy was it, because obviously they've been a ship that's been sailing in a certain direction for quite a long time. How easy was it to turn that and to get them to open up and accept that actually, yes, they needed to change the way they were collecting, and as it sounds like you've managed to achieve quite a large organizational change as well, which is no mean feat. So how
it's
easy
interesting.
Was it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I've been there 12 years and I actually worked in a lot of different like museums before, a lot of different projects like globally, like Africa, America, national museums and small collections as well. And so, but I've been at MCC a long time, and alongside that I've been like volunteering and trustee for other museums and stuff. But I was just for a long time just observing, how it was, looking at my skills, what I could do in terms of like bringing it up to accreditation standards. And then I always had this kind of like, burning desire to do quite quite sort of like revolutionary, like off the wall, impactful things, you know, but I've been told, like, obviously, like, not like recently as well, like it's a museum, it's a clubhouse, it's a domestic space, you know, part of our collection we can't show in kind of, you know, like in a way that you would in a contemporary art museum. Perhaps it's not appropriate, but just through like projects and interpretations, like there is scope. Yeah, so I just think in terms of like timings as well. So as I said, for a long time I was just sort of observing how things work, you know, inputting, you know, within a sort of remit. But then with this women's cricket project, you know, and because I got some sort of sponsors with a lot of weight who were sort of singing a similar tune, you know, we were able to put forward yeah, some quite sort of challenge, like ideas. And I think people just when I was talking over the last 3 years about what we were doing, it just became sort of like, yeah, more normal. And then in the light of like Black Lives Matter and our sort of like collection review and looking at diversity, because I had the background from when I was a postgrad, I just sort of like stepped up and I was like, you know, this is what other places have done. And we just reached out and I was talking to Chris really early on, actually, before he started doing the Ignored Histories, well, as he started doing the Ignored Histories report, and just talking about women's cricket and what I'd done previously. And, you know, some of our portraits at Lord's have got sort of slave traders, slave owners in them. And I think initially we reacted quite like a knee-jerk reaction. And I very much sort of like stepped in and said, you know, we can't hide history, we can't ignore it, looking at reinterpretation projects. And, you know, so the past year, it's become really normalized for us to talk about, you know, any bias in collecting or attitudes. And especially because I presented on a number of different case studies from, you know, beyond the sports heritage sort of museums and networks, what people are doing globally. And I think just by seeing other people's stories, other institution stories and how they're approaching things, all these case studies, we were just able to put ourselves into a sort of like context. And now we're having like quite interesting conversations all the time. And I'm really excited for the future direction and how the collection and how the sort of club is going to move forward.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, it sounds like you made a really strong case, and yeah, it's really interesting that you create the context and then put yourself in it. That's a really interesting way of looking at it. Verity, if you wanted to jump in.
Hello, hi Charlotte. Thank you for speaking today. I'm a freelance curator and consultant. I'm actually working with Steve, who's also on this call, at Trent Bridge in Nottinghamshire on a women's cricket scoping study. So we're just kind of at the early stages of that at the moment. But I was wondering whether you've got a team of volunteers that you work with, and also sort of how you started, or any sort of top tips for embarking on a project like you've been talking about, and yeah, kind of the things to avoid or things you might have learned in hindsight. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so when I started at MCC, like the team was really small, and initially we did have 6 volunteers actually, and I'd done a lot of like volunteer like management training and stuff, and thinking about what skills I could offer them back and what experiences like they could take back, and I'm putting them on very particular projects to like sort of, they were quite early year, like collections, conservators and archivists. But then luckily, after these projects got going, we did secure funding so that we could have like some contractors and contract work. So some of those volunteers became like contractors, and then most of them actually became full-time staff, because we saw like, you know, how much they were doing and, you know, how much value they were adding. So it was really nice journey to see them come from like volunteers to contractors to full-time staff, and then within that like promoted as well, and from assistants to officers and now managers as well, like the archive, like to start with, you know, I was the only one with like some training in archives. but to have a full-time archivist now is just like great. And they really carved out their own niches as well, and just added so much value, and we could clearly see that. And so the funding was made like possible. But yeah, just in terms of like the evolution group, obviously they were all volunteers. Some of them were retired, some of them, you know, had other jobs, like they were lecturing on women's cricket or women in sport.
Yeah.
But it was great for them to showcase their work as well. So Raf's spoken before at conferences about her, you know, involvement from her perspective, but she'd never curated a show before, so that was an amazing opportunity to work with her. And also, like, alongside that, she's got a new book out, and we're promoting the book and supporting her other work. And, you know, she's very much involved with our conference and things. So it's kind of like two-way, like giving back, like how can we help them or help promote their work or promote them, or, you know, like next steps for the early career ones.
That's great, because we've actually been in touch and met with Raf about this project. So, and one or two other people as well. So yeah, we're kind of starting to get some support in that way in terms of academic.
Yeah, and any sort of PhD candidates or master's candidates, you know, that's so nice. But also because they were so passionate about the sport and the story and their work, it was easy and it was a pleasure, but also like inviting them to like nice matches, and it's also social for them to get together, and we'd have like nice teas and lunch and stuff, even if we just went down the road and paid for our own, you know. But we did a bit of mix of, you know, hosting them and, you know, just catching up over a coffee. But it was nice to create, like, we had a formal meetings, but then more like relaxed informal conversation. And actually that was when some really nice ideas came up, was the informal bits. Yeah,
sorry, and just another quick point, I was really interested that you said in terms of heritage being all around the ground and not just in the museum. And having been to had the opportunity to go to Lord's a few times, there's the museum, but obviously the heritage is all around the place, and actually that's very similar for Trent Bridge as well. So are there any kind of key things you would suggest or advise in terms of sharing?
Yeah, it has been quite challenging. I mean, you know, over the years we've had like display cases and stuff like built into stands and things like this. But I mean, you know, like it's often like an afterthought sometimes in the exhibit, in the stand build. So really trying to like work with contractors like early on. Like, just as soon as possible, getting the conversation started. And as I mentioned, like these satellite exhibitions, you know, sometimes they're just graphic displays if the environment's not suitable.
But you
just
can
like
share a story in that way.
Yeah, an arrow pointing back to, even if it's like a couple of objects or a few images, like pointing back to the museum. And obviously our tours are very active, and they sort of go all around the ground. And
I've been lucky enough to go on one a few years ago. It was great. Yeah, you've got some fab people working there. Good. Thank you very much.
Hi, Paul.
Hello, Charlotte. You all right?
How are you doing? Yeah, I'm good.
I'm very well, thank you. Nice to see you looking so well. I'm just picking up on a couple of points that you made there, Charlotte. And forgive me, I joined the meeting slightly late. I got Steve Lamotti's just joined as well from Nottingham as well, so which is good. For those of you that don't know, we have a Yorkshire Cricket Museum as well, which obviously tells the story, as it says on the tin, the story and development of Yorkshire cricket. And I'm developing what I've called a distributed heritage project, which kind of addresses, uses the museum as a focus, but then looks at each of our other stands. So our East stand, which is where the museum is, that's our main heritage focus. But we then look at the clientele who attend. We try and match the audience to the heritage that we have around there. So we'll be looking at doing current players, graphics of current players, etc. What I was going to say is that one of the challenges that we have is buy-in. And I don't mean that the people aren't broadly supportive of showcasing our heritage. It's just that, as I think Charlotte alluded to, we're always a bit last on the list when it comes to planning. So, for example, we're not able to put in place any graphics until all of the operational stuff, you know, everything from where fire alarms are going to go or where M&E vents are going to go. So we have some challenges around that. But anyway, I won't go on because other people will want to talk, but I'm very happy to share with you what I'm proposing in terms of our distributed heritage around the ground. And also, let's not lose sight finally of the websites. The website's hugely important because obviously that takes our collections and our heritage, as you'll appreciate, beyond the four walls of our stadia or respective grounds. That's enough from me.
Thanks, Paul. So we're just over time now. So are there any final comments before I hand back to Chris? Right, over to you, Chris.
Thanks so much, Fran, and thank you so much, Charlotte. That was fantastic insight into your work, and those questions were, yeah, the answers to your questions are really revealing and really, really, really useful. And there's so much more we could have spoken about, I'm aware. And just to emphasize the point you made before that, this is just one strand of lots of different work that you've got going on, and aware that there's things like the KTP projects, which we haven't even touched on, and you know, the fantastic work you're doing in terms of beginning explorations of British Asian cricket in Yorkshire, for example, and really, really kind of looking forward to seeing how that develops and what becomes of that. So yeah, it's been really, really fascinating to hear more from you and about your work. And thank you everyone else for coming and for sharing your thoughts and questions. It's been a really, really been a really nice session. It's been really like really conversational and very very informative. So thank you all for coming along and participating. The last workshop of the 3 will be next Friday. So if anyone wants to join us for that, please do. It will be with Sarah Priestley from Watford Museum. Watford have quite a close relationship with Watford FC, and they do a lot of work with fan groups, supporters, and with the club itself to develop their collections and offer different insights and perspectives on the history of the club. And Sarah will be talking to us about that work with their existing audiences and how they're going to utilize those existing connections to get some really kind of unique insights. But yeah, do join us for that. But again, thanks to Charlotte, thanks so much. And yeah, and I hope everyone got some useful insights from this session. And yeah, thank you all again. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks, Chris. Just to echo what you were saying, and thank you so much, Charlotte. I'll be sending round a wrap-up email and the link to the recording to this webinar in the next week or so, along with the first one for those who attended that. And as I say, it will be up on our webinar archive. So I'll just bring the session to a close there, and I hope you have a great rest of your Friday. Speak to everybody soon.